Joe, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Like you said, I'm Joe. I have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason. And I also have a book by the same name, Majesty of Reason, a short guide to critical thinking in philosophy. And yeah, I just do popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. So I've already covered the popular side, but on the scholarly side, I also publish books and articles on topics in philosophy of religion, metaphysics, and philosophy of time. So, and I think today we're going to be covering a book that is forthcoming with Springer. And the book is entitled Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. I'm the first author. It is co-authored with my friend Linford, soon to be Dr. Daniel J. Linford. And yeah, therein we just examine one philosopher. His name is Ed Feser. He has a bunch of different arguments for God's existence, and we basically argue that none of his arguments succeed. So it's a very substantive critical examination of his arguments for God's existence, as well as some other arguments put forward by other thinkers. But yeah.
Awesome. So what is your take on Ed Feser? Why do you think his arguments are unsuccessful?
Yeah, okay. So just a little backdrop. So Ed Feser, he is a philosopher at, I think it's Pasadena City College or something like that, in California. And he is what we call a Thomist philosopher. So he follows quite heavily in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was 13th century? I think he might have died in 1249, 1225, something like that. Anyway, but yeah, it's a big on Aristotelianism, big on act and potency and all these different scholastic jargon type things like that. And yeah, so anyway, that's a bit of a background, and he's also a Catholic. So yeah, he has this book called 5 Proofs of the Existence of God. And therein he develops, you guessed it, 5 proofs of the existence of God, or alleged proofs. I put proofs in quotation marks. He thinks that these are, as in his own words, the best arguments for God's existence on offer. He also thinks that they are sufficient to remove atheists from the real debate. He thinks that the objections that thus far leveled to them previous to his writing the book are staggeringly weak. These are all his words. And at the end of his book, he has a little QED, quod era demonstratum. So yeah, he definitely thinks that these are like knockdown proofs, things like that, which I definitely don't think. So yeah, maybe we could just go through each one and I could talk about some of the criticisms of each.
Yeah, for sure. So he essentially just takes Aquinas's proofs of motion and things and just rewords them in modern philosophy, right? It's essentially his take.
Some of his arguments are exactly like that. So that's his first argument. It is definitely like a kind of a rewording of Aquinas's argument for motion. So we can start with that one. That's his first proof. So we'll go through all 5. And yeah, so the first proof is what he calls the Aristotelian proof. And it is essentially, like you said, a rendition or a remodeling of Aquinas' first way, which is an argument from change or an argument from motion. And he actually, so he begins by making a distinction. He, as in Feser, we're going to be talking about Feser here. Feser begins by making a distinction between act and potency. So this is a basic fundamental distinction that carves nature at its joints. Everything is divided into act and potency. Act is just essentially the ways that things actually are. So I'm actually seated. I'm actually human. You and I are actually having a conversation. It's basically like all the occurrent, really robustly real existent present realities. By contrast, potency refers to things that can be, but actually are not. So I'm actually seated, but I'm potentially standing. So my standing is in potency. Similarly, I am not actually drinking water right now, but I could be drinking water right now. And so I have a potential to drink water. So we have this division of being or division of reality between act and potency. So where does Feser go from here? Well, he says, whenever a potency becomes actual, for instance, whenever I, let's say, take a drink, that my potential to take a drink becomes actual, he says that there has to be a cause that brings that about, essentially. So whenever a potency becomes actual, something causes that potency to become actual. And moreover, there are lots of potencies becoming actual right around us, right? My various muscles are firing right now, and I'm talking with you. So various potentials are becoming actual. Moreover, argues Phaser, these various changes and actualizations of potential that are going on right now presuppose a more fundamental actualization of potential, namely my potential for existence. So I have the potential to exist. That potential is currently actualized. And what Phaser wants to say is that there has to be an explanation of that actualization of the potential. Just as whenever a potential becomes actual, there needs to be some kind of cause or explanation of that. Similarly, my current potential that's being actualized right now for existing needs to have some kind of explanation or cause right here, right now. So we're not talking about my parents who conceived me a long while back. We're talking about right here, right now. What actualizes my potential? You might say it's something like oxygen and various environmental conditions like temperature or something. But whatever it is, there's something that actualizes my potential for existence right here, right now. Now, this introduces a kind of chain of actualizations of potential, a kind of chains of sustaining causation, where one thing is sustaining right here, right now, another thing in existence. And what Phaser says is that that can't be infinite. That chain of sustaining causes of existence cannot be infinite. And so it must terminate in some kind of uncaused first cause. And that uncaused first cause is not going to have it's not itself going to have a potential for existence that's actualized. And so Phaser concludes that it's an unactualized, what he says, a purely actual actualizer. So that's the first stage of his argument. And then the second stage of his argument just tries to say that this first cause, this sustaining cause, keeping things in existence, which is purely actual, he tries to say that that's God. So he tries to tease out various divine attributes. So if it's purely actual, then it has no potentials for change, so it's immutable. So we've got immutability. You might think that material things are changeable, they're mutable, and so it's immaterial. You might think that things that are in time are changeable in various respects. Since this thing is unchangeable, it must be timeless. So at least so far, we've got a timeless first cause that sustains other things in being, that's immaterial, that's immutable, and so on. And he tries to tease out various other divine attributes from this. But that's the Aristotelian proof. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
So what are your objections to his proof? Why doesn't it work in your view?
Oh my goodness, I have so many objections. Okay, we will try to be brief. Wow. So the different objections, let's see. One of them is that, so for me, I reject the metaphysics underlying this argument right from the get-go. So I don't accept that there is this thing called actuality and this thing called potentiality. So I grant, certainly, that there are ways things can be, but are not, that actually are not. But I don't think that that commits us to there being some kind of different way or mode of existence or mode of being which corresponds to potential being. No, I just think I think whatever is actual. I think existence and actuality are just coextensive. And so I reject that there are different ways of existing, that you could have like a potential way of existing and an actual way of existing. I think everything actually exists. I think everything that exists actually exists. And everything that's actual definitely could have various features. So I could be standing, I could be sitting, and so on. But again, I don't think that requires us to postulate this sort of potential to stand. And Phaser's argument explicitly does require there to be this kind of potency which somehow becomes actualized. So that's one thing that I would say. I reject that kind of underlying act potency metaphysical backdrop.
Question about that real quick. So
yeah,
like the response I normally get is that they say act and potency are essentially synonymous with any kind of a change. So if there is change, there is a way things were and a way things are, and there's the difference between those two. And they say that really that's all you need for the argument. There's a first kind of a thingy, and it must actualize all of the other kinds of a thingy, or in some way embody the way everything else exists. And that's really all you need. So the act and potency, the labels aren't really important there.
Yeah. So it kind of depends upon what we are trying to express with this. Are we trying to express these different ways of being or these different modes of existence, one of which is an actual way or whatever labels we want to use, and the other of which is a potential way? It just depends on what we're trying to express. If we're trying to express these different ways of being, I'm going to reject that. I think there's only one way of being, and it's actuality, it's existence, it's something like that. By contrast, you could kind of slightly modify Phaser's argument, which you might sort of be getting at, and you can modify it to kind of just take away this stuff about different ways of being, like actual and potential, and you could just say, hey, the things around us, they require sustaining causes. Chains of sustaining causes cannot be infinite, so there's an unsustained sustainer, as it were, an uncaused first cause in that respect. That would be a slight divergence from the way Phaser articulates it, though. So, but you're right that someone could respond by jettisoning that kind of ways of being and going that route. But yeah, that's one way of response. And I actually have a video on my channel with Dr. Trenton Merricks. He is a metaphysician, and he has a paper where he criticizes this view on which there are multiple ways of being. It's called ontological pluralism. He criticizes it and develops a reasonably forceful argument by my lights against it. So that's one criticism that I would level towards it. I would reject the kind of underlying metaphysics. Excuse me. The second response that I would level towards this is that I'm actually quite skeptical that things that are act potency composites, that is, things that can change in various ways, changeable beings, I reject that they require sustaining causes. I think things can simply persist in existence without requiring some kind of external, so long as nothing comes along to destroy them. And yeah, I mean, like just imagine just a particle, like alone, and it's just like every 10 seconds, it's maybe emitting some kind of burst of energy or something. That particle, it seems to me, if it's alone and there's nothing there to destroy it, it's just going to persist in existence. It doesn't require something to like, oh crap, it's going to revert to nothingness if something doesn't like continually help it out and bestow it existence. No, it seems to me that it's just going to simply persist without requiring some kind of external sustenance. And there are, of course, various arguments that you can give for this thesis, and part of the book is developing arguments for that and criticizing arguments against that thesis, what we can call existential inertia. Inertia insofar as things retain something in the absence of contrary factors, and existential insofar as that thing that they retain is existence, speaking very loosely, of course. So I would also reject.
How would you explain what pure act and the difference between that and something who is not pure act but just is an instantiation of one of the actual potential thingies? What is the difference between those two? What does it mean to be pure act?
That is a good question. Okay. Part of the problem is that a lot of these things are very, very difficult to understand because like I said at the beginning, they're kind of cast in this kind of medieval scholastic jargon. So I think the best way to understand something that's purely actual is to understand it as something that is unchangeable in all respects. So it's like super strongly immutable. It cannot change in any way, shape, or form. It cannot gain properties. It cannot lose properties. It cannot do one thing and then do another. It can't, it just doesn't change in any way whatsoever. And moreover, it cannot change in any way, shape, or form. So I think that's the best way. It's purely actual insofar as it's devoid of those potencies. And what that means is that it's devoid of potential for change. It cannot change. So it's immutable. I think that's the best way to think about it. Now, sometimes they build more into that. They say that it's somehow identical to existence itself or subsistent being itself. I'm sure you've heard that from certain Thomists. They even like to put in the kind of Latin phrase like ipsum esse subsistens. And yeah, I actually find it very difficult to understand that. But I can understand immutable, so like unchangeable. So hopefully that kind of gets it. And then how does that contrast with things that are what we might call not purely actual? So they're like mixtures of act and potency. Well, those are going to be changeable things. The various things around us, like I'm changeable, you're changeable. This cup, it's not really a cup, is it? It's a water bottle. A water bottle's changeable, and so on. So I think that's the best way to understand it. So his fundamental claim amounts to saying that changeable things require sustaining causes. And I want to say, no, why is that the case? Why can't it be the case that changeable things persist in existence without having something outside of them which like continually keeps them in existence? All you need to do is just say that, no, nothing has come along to destroy it yet. First, it was brought into existence, say, and second, nothing came along to destroy it. That's why it exists right now. That's a perfectly kosher explanation of why it exists right now that doesn't adduce or make reference to some kind of sustaining cause. And of course, for people who are interested, I develop this further on my blogs and my videos and so on. So,
yeah. So how does his argument address that you don't need something that is completely unchangeable? Say it's unchangeable in 10 ways and changeable in one way. Why would that be a problem in order to cause the origin of the universe? Say couldn't one of the unchangeable things ground the changeable things?
Yeah. So we should try to keep in mind that really what his argument is fundamentally focusing on is not necessarily a temporal origination of the universe, but more so a kind of foundation that's continually present and undergirding reality, that's sustaining non-fundamental things in existence. And your question then would become, why can't this thing that's sustaining other things, why can't it be changeable in some other respects and unchangeable maybe in some respects? Now, I actually think that that's a pretty good pushback. I actually don't think that he sufficiently justifies why it has to be unchangeable in absolutely every respect. Maybe, for instance, it's some sort of necessarily existent foundational quantum field or something, and that just sustains the less fundamental contingent things. That it could still change in various ways, like maybe it changes in certain intensities of its quantities or something, and maybe that's caused by certain prior states of it in conjunction with laws of nature. I don't really see anything problematic about that, and yet his argument would require ruling that out. And for me, I actually don't think he sufficiently justifies ruling that out. So I think you have kind of hit upon a pretty substantive criticism of the argument. To be sure, he tries to rule it out, but I argue in my book that it doesn't ultimately succeed. I should mention for the audience, before I turn it back to you, that the book is not out yet. It's the final draft is due in the summer. So hopefully, maybe by the end of 2022 or come early 2023, it'll be available, and I'll popularize it on my channel and other sorts of things. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I can add like a link in the description when you send me that when it's ready.
Oh, sweet.
So why you said he doesn't adequately explain that? How does he try to explain that away?
Yeah. So one thing that he says is, if it has any potentials whatsoever, then it's going to have a range. Like if it has any potentials whatsoever, even for, let's say, being in a different spatial location, one of those potentials is going to be, one of those potentials among the range of possible states that it could be in is going to be actualized. And what he's going to say is that there needs to be some kind of explanation for why that potential in particular is actualized, right? It genuinely could have failed to be actualized, right? Because it could have been in any of those other potential states. And he's going to want to say that there needs to be some explanation here and now why that potential is actualized here and now, rather than those other ones that easily could have been actualized right here and right now. And so he's basically going to want to say that you haven't actually reached the ultimate terminus of explanation. You need some further thing that explains why this thing with the potentials actualized as they are, why they are in fact that way, rather than some other way. So I think that's certainly one of the ways he goes about trying to respond.
Can't you respond by saying that, like we did before, that there's some collection of necessary things that are properties within this essence of act, and then it has one part that's like random, it has like a random number generator that creates another one. It can be other ways, but it seems like if that other way is determined by the necessary properties of the thing, it still fits the bill. Like why would that not solve the problem?
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is that right, Phaser thinks that this unchangeable thing has free will and even is libertarianly free. And so Phaser already grants that there is this kind of indeterminism, this kind of, in some sense, randomness almost, this kind of indeterminism between this purely actual thing and then its various created effects. And so what I almost see you as saying is like, why can't we have, in some sense, various necessary properties of the foundation, which in some sense indeterministically give rise to other potentials of that very foundation? So it's not actually purely actual. It has some potentials, and those are actually explained by more fundamental features of that very foundation. And so under this view, you don't actually have an unchangeable foundation, and nevertheless, you still kind of secure the explanatory goodies that he wanted to secure, as it were. I actually think that that's a good response, to be honest. So yeah. And I actually developed quite similar things in the chapters of my book on this argument. So,
does he make the "it must be perfectly simple" argument that it can only have one property?
So he does hold to divine simplicity. In this particular argument, what he only tries to show is that it's purely actual or unchangeable, and then he tries to get various divine attributes from that. But in a later chapter of his book, he does say that it is absolutely simple in the sense of it has all of its properties are numerically identical to one another and with God himself. There's nothing intrinsic to it that's distinct from it. And so, yeah, omnipotence is just going to turn out to be numerically identical to omniscience on this view, which is numerically identical to God himself, which is numerically identical to timelessness, and so on. Lots of theists think that that's a big bullet to bite, and that's actually why lots of theists reject Phaser's arguments. So yeah.
So how would you respond to that? Like, what does it? Is there any limit to the number of different things that can be asserted to be numerically identical to the one substantive act property thing? Or can you just put in anything you want and say, oh, I like this property, we're gonna put that into the mix and say it's all just one thing?
Yeah, are there limits? That's a good question. I guess So I'll put on my phaser hat and try to respond. What I think he would say is something along the lines of, well, I'm not just sort of adding these in a kind of unmotivated fashion, or maybe I just want to have it, so I just add it into the mix and say it's identical to the other ones. Rather, he does try to give arguments to tease out the various divine attributes. So he does try to argue from his various premises that he thinks things require sustaining causes, and the fact that this thing would have to be unchangeable and simple. He tries to go from that to get you these divine attributes. So he says it must be immaterial. Why? Because if it were material, well, then it would have various properties. It would be complex in some way, and it would also be changeable in various ways. But we know that it's unchangeable and simple, and so it's not material. So that's how he gets, for instance, immaterial. And then he tries to do that with lots of other divine attributes. So he tries to secure that it's actually wholly good, that it is an intellect, that it has freedom, that he tries to get the whole gambit almost, really. And his arguments there. I have a whole chapter on his what we call the two case. It's the identification stage, trying to identify God, and I think it's very not good arguments. I have to be honest. So yeah, I guess if we could actually talk about stage 2, because this is another thing. Like, even if you granted stage 1 of the Aristotelian proof that we're talking about right now, even if you granted that, you're still extremely far away from theism. There are lots of perfectly naturalistically acceptable foundations of reality that kind of secure these explanatory demands. There are these philosophers, and their names are Alyssa Ney, Jill North, Julian Barber. Actually, what's his name? Sean Carroll has written on this as well. What we might call wave function monism. It's basically taking certain theories in physics, and they develop a kind of metaphysics on the basis of it, where there's this foundation of reality. It's the universal wave function. It's a sui generis physical object, and it functionally realizes everything else. And so space-time would be non-fundamental. This is actually supported by some empirical results as well. But under that view, this wave function, or at least under some of their views, the wave function itself is non-spatio-temporal. And what that means is that there's a sense in which it's unchangeable, right? Because to be changeable, like you're existing within time or something along those lines. And so if this physical object, right, remember, if this physical object is non-spatio-temporal, then it's going to be unchangeable. It's going to satisfy these requirements for being purely actual. And we can also say that it's necessarily existent and so on. So we can even grant like contingency arguments. But nevertheless, this is a perfectly naturalistically respectable view. It doesn't require you to go all the way, even go anywhere close to God almost, really. So I actually do find that to be a plausible criticism. Like, even if you grant stage 1, and I've given reasons for thinking we shouldn't grant it, but set that aside, even if you granted stage 1, stage 2, I just don't find it plausible. And you can be a satisfied naturalist and accept stage 1, it seems to me.
And that's where he says it must be perfectly good. It has the goodness property, and the wave function isn't perfectly good. It's just a wave function.
Yes, exactly. Dude, the way that he tries to get perfect goodness, what he does is he says he takes a privation theory account of evil. So he says, essentially, to be less than perfectly good is in some sense to have a privation. That's what he wants to say. It's to lack something. It's to be devoid of something that in some sense you should have, given the ends built into your nature. But this thing, he says, can't have any privations, because a privation entails potency. That's what he says. A privation would entail potency. Why is that? Well, because if you have a privation, then there's something that you're missing, as it were, that in some sense you ought to have. And if you're missing something that you ought to have, it seems as though you have at least the potential to have it. And if you have the potential to have it, well, then you have some potential. But we concluded that this thing is purely actual, so it has no potentials, so it has no privations, in which case it is perfectly good. That's what he wants to say. Now, this is not a plausible argument, but that's what he wants to say.
Yeah. So my question would be is like, if you're going to say goodness is or evil is the privation of goodness, why can't you do that to any property? Why is goodness special there? Why can't I say potato is the privation, or non-potato is the privation of potato, and so potato is the perfect necessary property that must be entailed in the substance thingy? Why is good qualify in this case as opposed to any other property we can just assert as being a privation?
Yeah, so this will probably depend on, I guess, his kind of metaphysical backdrop, like his backdrop beliefs. Like in this kind of scholastic medieval tradition, they have this worked out theory of evil, and what they're going to want to say is that they have independent reasons for thinking it. I don't think it's all that plausible. So honestly, I mean, I don't even feel qualified to try to steelman it for them. So as for like the non-potato thing, I mean, they are going to say that yes, there are other privations that don't have to do with good and evil. So in some sense, my desk. Well, I guess we shouldn't use my desk. Let's use blindness, right? So someone who's blind might not be, let's just say, just by dint of being blind, they're not evil or they're not bad or anything like that. But blindness is, in some sense, what they're going to want to say, a privation, right? It's an absence of sight. It's an absence of the proper functioning of various organs. And if that's the case, well, then we have a context, which is outside the context of good and evil, in which there are these sorts of privations and so on apply. And that's one kind of approach that they might take in response to your question there. And they might say, hey, that seems kind of plausible. It seems as though blindness is in some sense an absence or a lack of something that ought to be there. Now, this, of course, gets difficult when you get into things like pain, right? I mean, there seems to be this positive phenomenal character, this phenomenally conscious character associated with pain. And that just seems to be bad. That seems to be evil. There doesn't seem to be like a privation there or an absence of something. There seems to be a positive presence of something that's like positively like bad. Now, of course, thinkers in that tradition try to respond to this and so on. And the debates go back and forth. But a lot of people reject this theory actually on the basis of things like pain. And also false beliefs. You'd be surprised. You get into lots of puzzles when you try to say that the badness of forming certain false beliefs is accounted for in terms of privations. Like what's absent there? Is there an absence of a correspondence with reality? But then if you have negative beliefs, like beliefs in the absences of things, it's like you have to say there's absences of absences. It gets super weird. But anyway, I'll turn it back to you.
So Git had a super chat. Thank you for the super chat. Git, he said, I don't know if you watched Lex Friedman or not, but he had a guest on named Joshua Bach, and he talked about the possibility of consciousness being virtual, which would solve the mind-body problem, ? Would consciousness being virtual solve the mind-body problem?
I guess I'll diverge and go along with this. So would consciousness being virtual solve the mind-body problem? I guess we're still left wondering, what is consciousness still? Like, even if it's virtual, like, what is its nature? Is it identical to the functional realizer, like whatever the let's say the hardware that the virtual program is running on? Is it identical to the program? Is it something over and above it? Is it generated by the program? So you're still left with these sorts of questions. Like, what is this consciousness? Is it something non-physical that's generated by these sorts of things, or is it identical to them? I think we're still left with the problem. It's a very interesting proposal, and I don't want to like rule it out here, especially because this goes along with various functionalists, which are quite popular. But to me, it doesn't seem to like solve it automatically. We're still left with lots of questions. Like, what is the nature of this thing? How does it relate to the substrates that kind of functionally realize it, and so on?
Related question. Do you think that saying consciousness is fundamental solves the hard problem of consciousness? Do the panpsychists in any way have any advantage here? Or are they just asserting, it's just a thing, we're just done?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Let's see. I mean, in some sense, yeah. So, sorry, I'm thinking, because we had one of my I'm in a philosophy of mind class right now, and we talked a lot about panpsychism and its various problems and so on. I mean, it almost depends on what we're saying the problem of consciousness is. If we're talking about the problem of like real minds, like you and me and so on, it's hard for me to see how panpsychism could solve that, right? Because even if we have all these itty bitty consciousnesses associated with like electrons and things like that and protons, how does that come together to form this richly unified, us having a conversation about philosophy of mind and these sorts of things? Like, I'm still left completely in the dark. Like, how do you go from these little itty bitty consciousnesses to somehow this macro consciousness that's here and that's unified and that's enjoying all the various conscious states that I'm enjoying? So like, I'm still wondering, okay, like, how does that relate to the various conscious properties of the parts? Do those somehow lose their consciousness, and are they subservient to mine? Or like, are they both there? Is there like a ton of like way more consciousness than I think there is in my brain? Or like, it gets really weird. And so it's not clear to me that it actually solves it. And you might even say it dissolves it. I mean, if you're just saying it's fundamental, then you're just saying like, yeah, okay, fine. We're not going to explain it. We're just going to take it for granted. We're going to take consciousness for granted. We're just going to put it there at the fundamental layer of reality. And then we're just going to try to build up from there. But, of course, they have various arguments for it. And, the debate continues. So, but I guess for macro subjects like you and me, I lean towards thinking it doesn't solve it.
Cool. So back to Phaser and goodness being a fundamental thingy of some kind. You gave his perspective of why you think he would think goodness is a privation of evil because of prior arguments, but do you think there's any substantive difference between goodness and, say, any other property we could like arbitrarily make up? Is there any way to actually discern which should be considered privations or not? And if there isn't, couldn't we arbitrarily put any property we wanted into this God thingy?
Is there not? I mean, I'm guessing there might be. I guess I'm probably just not sufficiently familiar with like the theory of privation, the privation theory of evil, to be able to say what their principled motivations are. But I'm guessing that they have them, so I guess that's my response. Part of the reason is that I don't find it plausible for like the pain reason and various other things. But like, are there principled reasons? I mean, in some cases, yes. So like you can't just say that. Let's see, like the blackness of this water bottle is a privation, because like it's not there doesn't seem to be an absence of anything there. Like it's a positive presence of some sort of reality. Like the blackness, it's here, you can see it, it exists, it's real, it's not a lack, it's not a privation, it's not a deficiency that's like a gaping hole in something. So I guess that's one sort of criterion that you could use. You could say if it's actual, if it's some sort of actually occurrent thing, then it's not going to be a privation, because a privation is in some sense an absence of something actual. So that's one criterion that they could use. Okay. Go on.
Quick question, because that one is the one I've thought about the most. If you say any positive property is essentially on a spectrum, and the reason it's black, because like light, black is the absence of light or whatever, you could say, well, this actual thing that we think is actual, well, actually, it's really just the privation of this other greater thing that isn't there yet. And so we can take any actual property and say it's the privation of some greater property we just don't know about yet. And why would that not be analogous to the goodness case?
That's a good point. Like some things that we think are in some sense positive realities might actually turn out to be an absence of positive realities. Some people might have thought that, way back before we knew a lot about light, that let's say being in a dark room, and you might think that the darkness is, you almost reify it. Maybe there's some sort of darkness particle that's covering everything that you think is some sort of positive reality, and so it wouldn't just be a privation of light; it would actually be some sort of positive reality, and it's all right. But of course, we discovered that that's false. So yeah, I mean that is a challenge that has to be overcome by anyone who wants to make these sorts of claims. Like, how do we know that in this particular case we aren't mistaking a positive reality for the absence of some other positive reality that we just haven't discovered yet? So I actually think that's a question that they probably have to answer. So I'm actually kind of with you there. I actually don't really. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point.
Awesome. Let's go into the second argument that Fraser brings up.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, this one is actually. So some of the reviewers of the book, like people who wrote professional reviews of it, actually pointed out that it's like they almost think that the whole book only contains two proofs because four of the proofs are so similar to one another. And this is another one that's really similar to the first one. So it actually doesn't take me much to lay it out. The basic idea is that, hey, there are composite objects around us, not only composites of physical parts, but also composites. So I should say it's called the Neoplatonic proof. So for anyone interested, I have a video on my channel on the Neoplatonic proof and basically on all these proofs. So anyone who wants to delve deeply into this, they can check that out. But yeah, it's called the Neoplatonic proof. And the idea is that anything that's composite, whether it's a physical composite like this notebook or me, or if it's a metaphysical composite, so if it's like a composite of various properties, like distinct properties from one another. So even if there's like a fundamental physical particle, it would still have various distinct properties that in some sense go to make it up. So it would have charge and spin and mass and velocity and things like that. So what he wants to say is that, hey, anything that's composite, whether physically or metaphysically composite, it's going to require some kind of sustaining cause that keeps its parts together, something that combines them, that accounts for their unity together into a unified whole. So we have this claim, anything composite requires a sustaining cause. The second basic claim is that anything or any chain of sustaining causes cannot descend infinitely. And so you get to a first cause of composite things. Now, could this first cause be composite? Well, no, because if it were composite, then per our other premise, it would require a further cause, right? And we're assuming that this is an uncaused cause, because there can't be an infinite chain of sustaining cause. And so we get to this absolutely simple uncaused first cause. And it's absolutely simple. It's not only made up of no physical parts, but it's also made up of no metaphysical parts. So like all of its properties are identical to one another. And, there aren't sort of distinct things from it that go to make it up or build it up. So that's and of course, the second stage of this argument. So that was the first stage. The second stage tries to say, hey, that thing has various divine attributes. So it kind of proceeds much as before.
So what is your position on these divine attributes being piled together? Like, is it coherent to say that the single kind of act thing has free will, like you brought up earlier, and free will, consciousness, desires, those kinds of things seem to be inherently human contingent kinds of things? How can you say that they're not of the contingent variety and they're of this perfect act, and any more so? How's that any more plausible than saying there's a pineapple that's a part of this thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least in the present case, I know the pineapple was just an example, but they're going to want to try to push back on that. Like, a pineapple has various physical parts, and so this thing pineapple couldn't be part of it, because then this thing would have parts. But we assume that it doesn't have parts, or we didn't assume it. We apparently demonstrated it. We apparently proved it with like 30 quotation marks around proof. So, yeah, like,
but couldn't we say the same thing about consciousness and free will, or of those kinds of things? Those things seem to have parts in human brains too. So all of the known parts of these human-related identity, consciousness-related things seem to be analogous to the pineapple, in that it's the only examples we have are composites. And if you want to say, well, no, it's only like a representation of some more fundamental essence of consciousness, couldn't we say the same thing about the pineapple? The pineapple is actually just abstract representation of the essence of pineapple, and it's actually inside of the act thingy.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in us, it does seem to be the case that like free will and our desires and so on, like these things are different aspects of us, and like in some sense they go to make us up. And so like, how would that not transfer over to this being? Like, if it has free will, surely it has various desires that are different from one another, and surely it has choices that are different from its desires. So that does seem kind of plausible. And actually what they're going to want to say, I think, is they're just going to say like, sorry, but these sorts of things don't transfer over to God. Like, yeah, that's true for various finite intellects like you and me, finite creatures. The various desires that we have and beliefs that we have and choices that we make, those are distinct in us. But when it comes to God, they're not distinct in God. Now, what sort of delimits them? Why can they get all these privileged properties assigning to God and not others? Again, Phaser is going to want to try to tease out various deductions, essentially arguments for this. So, I mean, they're not good arguments, but they are arguments. It's hard for me to say. I mean, like seriously, like his argument for free will is like nothing compels this being, because to compel it would in some sense be to actualize one of its potentials, and it has no potentials, so nothing compels it. And moreover, he says he's previously established that it's an intellect, firstly, and secondly, nothing compels it to act as it does. And so he concludes from that it has free will. I'm like, well, you don't get free will merely from the fact that it's an intellect and nothing compels the way that it acts. It could still just be like randomly spitting out like effects. Like, you don't get free will from that. It's so implausible. And his arguments for like being an intellect itself are super implausible. So like, yeah, anyway, like in some sense, I do think you're hinting at like some of the major objections that I have to stage 2. It's just a lot of these inferences are not plausible. And I do think still, like, yeah, anyway, the naturalist is going to be able to incorporate a lot of these sorts of first stage arguments, saying that there's this necessary foundation of reality without adopting all this implausible second stage stuff.
Do you think we could make parallel or equally as bad arguments for alternative hypotheses? Like, what is the quality of these arguments that he thinks makes them successful, and could we utilize that, whatever he thinks makes them successful, to argue for an alternative hypothesis?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I actually think, yes, that's true. That is correct. So even thinkers within this sort of tradition of thinking of some sort of transcendent ultimate reality that's super simple and immutable, they diverge on how they characterize it, right? And they give various arguments and considerations for their diverging conceptions. So like, I'm going to be honest with you. If I came to accept that there's this kind of transcendent ultimate reality, which is single and unique and it's immutable and simple, I would say it's some sort of impersonal Brahman-like principle. It's something that's just almost ineffable, and yes, it's the source of everything else, but it's not like personal or desires in any sense or anything like that. And I mean, you could argue for that. You could say, like, it seems as though being personal, you'd have to act on various reasons, and you'd have to be sensitive to those. And so those, it would seem as though your choices would be different from those prior explaining reasons, right? There seems to be an explanatory relation between reasons and one's choice. And if something is explaining another thing, you at least have two sorts of realities there, it seems. And so this thing wouldn't be absolutely simple if it chose. So it seems, you might say, because you'd minimally at least have the choice and then the prior reasons upon which that choice depends, or at least it's explained by. And so if it were absolutely simple, if there weren't these different aspects of it, it would seem to be impersonal. It would seem to be this kind of just like impersonal Brahman-like Neoplatonic one that just like maybe emanates everything else, or in some sense grounds everything else. So actually, I'm with you. I do think that you could use similar sorts of arguments that are arguably even more plausible for alternative conceptions, even granting this kind of absolutely simple, unchangeable foundation. Now, of course, I go through my book and explain why we shouldn't grant that. I actually think basically all these the first stages of these arguments fail, but yeah.
Yeah, so I like the example you used before of the monistic wave function thing. Like, if we do grant there's this one thing outside of space-time that causes everything else and is perfectly simple, a mathematical structure seems to fit that fairly accurately, and more so than a mind. So I would definitely think that, why would he omit this as a possibility? Because it seems like you do the same thing that theists do, where they list all the properties of God. Oh, it's spaceless, timeless, immaterial. That sounds a lot like a God. We could just take all of Fager's arguments, like, oh, look, all of this perfect act in the city sounds a lot like a mathematical object.
Yeah. One thing you'll probably say to that is like, intuitive. Again, I have my phaser hat on. He'll probably say something like, mathematical objects can't cause anything. So he might say that they're causally effete or acausal. You won't, for instance, find like the number 2. He won't bounce up against it, or like you won't discover it in a garage somewhere or anything like that. It doesn't seem to cause anything. The number 2 is just kind of there. It doesn't really bring anything about. It doesn't have that kind of causal oomph, as it were. Now, one thing you might say in response is like, no, maybe some mathematical things can cause things. Maybe we just discovered one example. You might say that. So yeah, that would probably be a natural response at that juncture. And you don't even have to say it's mathematical. Again, you could say maybe this universal wave function is in some sense like way simpler than we thought it was. Why not? That's essentially what I'm thinking. Now they might say, oh, well, it has various quantitative aspects, because physical science does assign some sort of quantitative attributes to it. And they might try to say, I've actually heard Thomas say this, like, for instance, Trent Horn, he said, like, oh, well, if it has various quantitative features, then it's going to have potentials. And I just want to say, like, hold on a second. You guys are Trinitarians. You can't make this argument. That's a quantity, right? That's 3 persons. It's not 2. It's not 4. It's not infinitely many. That's 3 persons. That's a quantity, okay? And so if you think that quantities imply potential, you're going to have to give up Trinitarianism. And with it, Christianity, it seems. Okay, if they want to do that, that's fine by me. But they're trying to use this argument really, ultimately, I think, in a kind of case for Christianity. So,
got another super chat from Git. Thank you for the super chat. The issue with philosophy is that the issue of language. We ascribe all kinds of conceptual factors to ideas that don't necessarily exist. This spans from metaphysics to epistemology. What is your view on the value of philosophy? Is it all just a language game?
good question. So, certainly some philosophical debates. Some can be resolved, or perhaps more accurately, dissolved by greater clarification of language. So some people, for instance, think that debates about what composite objects there are actually are like linguistic debates. So, you have people who are Mereological universalists who say that any 2 objects combine to form a whole. And then you have Mereological nihilists say that no 2 objects, no 3 objects, no objects combine to form wholes. There are only just these simple Mereological atoms, simple things. So chairs don't actually exist. Particles arranged chairwise exist. So that's what you're kind of experiencing in some sense. But the chair itself, as some entity over and above the particles, that doesn't exist. That's what they say. And then you have what we might call restrictivists. They say we can restrict. We don't have to go the universalist route and say absolutely everything composes everything, really. And you don't have to go the nihilist route. You can just maintain our ordinary common sense intuitions. Now, some people have argued that this is actually maybe it's more so linguistic. I mean, maybe like what we call a chair is we can understand it in one sense as just a collection of particles, and in another sense, like an actual object in its own right that we can interact with, and so on. So I'm not here endorsing that view, but my point is just that some debates in philosophy are amenable to this kind of analysis, but others aren't. I mean, it's not just a mere linguistic fact or something that can be resolved merely by conceptual analysis, like whether or not, let's say, God exists, right? That's a substantive question. It's not like linguistics, like there either is a God or there isn't, and something either answers to these traditional descriptions of omniscience, omnipotence, and so on, or it doesn't. And that's a substantive philosophical question. It doesn't dissolve upon examining language or these other sorts of things. So I certainly think in some cases that's true, but in many, many, many cases it's not.
So like the Theseus' ship example, which one is Theseus' ship?
Lots of people think that that is going to be semantic. Yeah, that's going to be linguistic. I don't have a view on that because I haven't studied it. It's outside my area of research. So, but lots of people do think. Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what we want to designate as the ship. Like it doesn't really. We're not like carving reality at its joints when we're talking about that. So yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So let's go to the third argument. What is Fazier's third argument?
Yeah, so this third argument is what he calls an Augustinian proof. And long story short, it says, firstly, abstract objects exist. So what are abstract objects? They are things like numbers and functions and properties and universals and possible worlds and propositions and all these different sorts of things. So he says that they exist. And then he says, there are only 3 accounts of such things. Of course, you have nominalism, but he says that they exist, so he's rejecting nominalism about them, or anti-realism about them. So then he says you either have an Aristotelian view on which they're either identical to or otherwise grounded in just ordinary concrete particulars around us. Then you have Platonism, which says that there's this kind of non-causal third realm that's not grounded in the mundane, ordinary stuff around us, and also not grounded in any of our minds or in anyone's mind. It just kind of exists ungrounded in this kind of timeless, spaceless Plato's heaven, as it were. And then thirdly, there is a kind of theistic conceptualism. You take all that Platonic third realm and you just shove it in God's mind. So that's essentially what they're doing. And what he says is that he argues that those first 2 views are false. So Aristotelianism is false, Platonism is false. Hence, you get theistic conceptualism. So God exists. That's basically the argument.
So your view, do you agree abstract objects exist in the first part?
So that's a tricky question. So for some of them, I'm an anti-realist about. So for instance, I don't think there are possible worlds. I tend towards anti-realism about possible worlds, for instance. But I mean, I actually do find it plausible that mathematical objects exist, for instance. I kind of like indispensability arguments. I think that we have good reason to believe what's indispensable to our best scientific theories of the world. And I do think it's plausible that mathematical objects and commitment to mathematical truths and so on, I do think that's indispensable to our best science. And so I think that gives us good reason to think that there are such mathematical objects. And I think they would be abstract. So I actually kind of lean towards accepting his first stage where he says realism is true. But it's not like a super hardcore commitment. I actually have a lot of respect for nominalism. I had someone who actually defended nominalism as his whole dissertation. His name is Kenny Boyce. I had him on my channel. Yeah, I was proud of that thumbnail. It said, by the way, 1 + 1 = 2 is false, because he defends that. He, of course, thinks that, yes, if you have one object and another object, then you have 2 objects. But he doesn't think that like 1 + 1, strictly speaking, = 2 is true. He doesn't think that that's true because he thinks that would require you to commit to like the number 1 and the number 2. And he doesn't think that there are any numbers because he's a nominalist. So anyway, yeah, I actually have respect for the nominalist position, more so than many.
Would that be because that sounds like the moral position that there's not even coherent? Because would it be false in that case if he thinks numbers are not real things, or would it be more of a non-cognitive position about numbers?
Good. Yeah. So he thinks that they're uniformly false. So it's almost like an error theory of sorts. So he wouldn't say it's non-cognitivist. He just says, nope, these things, if they were true, they would have to be corresponding to some kind of abstract mathematical reality. But because he's an anomalist, there is no such reality. So these sorts of mathematical claims actually aren't true. But he does say that they're useful fictions. So we can speak as if they're true. So that's kind of how he almost has his cake and eats it too. But
yeah, that makes sense. Like if he says that if the mathematical sentence "to be true" must correspond to some kind of abstract reality, then I can understand why it would be false. Defining it that way.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I'm actually sympathetic to that kind of realism, but again, it's just a leaning. And yeah, so what about the other sorts of parts of the argument? I mean, I actually don't think he successfully rules out Aristotelianism or Platonism. Um, there are boatloads of philosophers today that defend these sorts of views. James Franklin defends Aristotelian realism really, really well. Lots of philosophers defend Platonism really, really well. And Fazer's own theistic conceptualism faces a number of problems of its own that are like super significant in my view. So I actually think that theistic conceptualism is the least attractive of those three theories by my lights. So yeah, that's what I would argue. And something I actually want to say is interesting. Fazer, remember, we wanted to say that he takes all these. He says whatever is in God is identical to God, right? This is his absolute simplicity view that we were talking about earlier. Well, what seems to throw a wrench in that is divine conceptualism, right? You have this infinitude of abstract objects that are existing in God's mind. Those aren't identical to one another, and they're not identical to God. And
The
so
number two is all powerful and all good.
I know, right? Because that's absurd to say, it follows that the number two is distinct from God. And because we have realism, it follows that the number two exists. So there's something that exists and that's intrinsic to God because they have theistic conceptualism, right? It's within God's mind. So we have something distinct from God and intrinsic to God, which means that God is not absolutely simple in the sense that he wants to say. So I argue. It just seems to be an inconsistency by my lights. Now, of course, I go through various maneuvers that they try to say in response in my book, and I argue that they fail. So I actually do think ultimately this is probably a big tension there.
Yeah. So what is their response to say that if God is synonymous with his ideas and there are tons of abstract ideas, that they must all necessarily be God? Each idea is God unto itself. How would they refute that?
One thing they say is they try to say, okay, what we mean when we say that everything within God is identical to God is everything that really exists within God is identical to God. And then they're going to want to say that abstracta don't really exist. They conceptually exist. So they make a distinction among different ways of being or like modes of existence. They say that, yeah, in some sense, abstracta are like they're existent, but they only exist in a merely conceptual way. They don't have the robust real reality that God has.
How is that different from nominalism? That's just nominalism.
I know. Okay, that's how I say it. I mean, that's how I see it. But they're going to say, no, conceptual existence is not non-existence. That's what they're going to want to say. So yeah, it requires this kind of ontological pluralism that we were talking about earlier, where there are these different modes of existence or ways of being. And I mean, it's actually hard for me to even wrap my mind around that, to be honest. I mean, I almost find it unintelligible. But setting that aside, we do argue in the book that this is it's creeping very, very close to nominalism in a way that actually kind of subverts the arguments that Fazer used to get to realism in the first place. It seems as though if you want to get to realism in the first place, they have to like have that kind of robust real existence rather than mere conceptual existence to do the explanatory heavy lifting that they're doing. So that's something that we argue. Now, that's only one response that some theistic conceptualists make, or that some proponents of divine simplicity make to get around this. There are some other responses, but that's the main one. But yeah, we could probably go on to the fourth argument at this point.
Sure.
Yeah. So the fourth argument is something, again, this is the next two arguments, the fourth and the fifth, are categorized with the first two in that they're arguments from sustaining causation. And it's basically the same thing as what we've covered. The fourth argument basically says, hey, things around us, they have a distinction between their essences and their existences. So what they are is distinct from the fact that they are. So what it is to be a human, for instance, is distinct from the active existence of some particular human, say. So that they're gonna want to say there's a distinction between their essence and their existence, and anything which is a composite of essence and existence requires a sustaining cause to kind of keep them together, right? We saw this earlier when composites require a sustaining cause, and so if everything that's a composite of essence and existence requires a sustaining cause, and if chains of sustaining cause cannot be infinite, well, then we get to something which is an uncaused first cause in which essence is numerically identical to existence. So this is where you get the kind of subsistent being itself, right? Its essence is identical to its existence. So that's
Is there
a
an
basic
argument
precedent.
for that? Like, couldn't you just say essences and existences are like two completely separate or orthogonal properties that exist at the same time, but are completely separate and there's nothing that is both its essence and its existence? Why would they need to overlap at some point?
Yeah, I mean, what they're going to want to say is anything in which that essence is distinct from its existence, we need some explanation as to why they are unified together. And that explanation is going to come in terms of something that kind of concurrently combines them, that causally sustains them. And so because you can't have those infinite changes of sustenance, it's going to have to bottom out in something that's first, that's uncaused. And if that thing were a composite of essence and existence, then it would in turn require further cause, right? Because it needs something to combine those together, as it were, and explain why they're unified. And so it's not a composite of those two. Rather, its essence is identical to its existence. So that's something that they're going to want to say in response to that. Now, you can probably guess how I'm going to reject this. I mean, the first stage, again, existential inertia, I think, is probably going to do some major damage to this. I don't think things that are, well, firstly, I would reject the underlying metaphysics here. That's like distinctions between essences and existences and so on. But even setting aside that rejection, you could have, or I argue that it's perfectly plausible to say that essence existence composites just persist in existence in the absence of something that kind of continually sustains them, so long as nothing destroys them, right? That's all you need to cite in order to explain, like, why does this cup exist? Why did it continue to exist from the beginning that you and I have talked? The obvious explanation is, well, it was there at the beginning, right? And nothing came along to destroy it, right? No one came along to no one exploded TNT in this room. No one, thank goodness, no one came along to cut this up or use a hydraulic press to nothing came along to destroy it. That's why it exists right now. That's why it exists right now. And it was brought into existence, firstly. And secondly, nothing came along to destroy it. That sufficiently explains, arguably, why it exists right now. That's all we need to cite. And similarly, I would argue, and I do this extensively in the book and elsewhere, that you don't need some kind of external sustaining cause that combines essence and existence. You could just cite this kind of existential inertia.
So I've never understood the concepts of essence and existence. Could there be, because each object has some part of both, right? And then God is supposed to be a perfect thing that is both. Could you have one object that is perfect existence and one object that is perfect essence, and they're completely separate objects? How do these objects work together in some sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what they're going to want, what they're going to want to say is okay, here's a principle. Everything is either such that its essence and existence are distinct, or such that its essence is numerically identical to its existence. Right? That's like a true dichotomy. Everything falls into one of those two categories. Then they're going to want to say anything that falls into that former category, where its essence is distinct from its existence, per this argument that they think succeeds, has to be explained in terms of something in which essence and existence are identical. Okay, so we've got all these things. None of those things are going to be divine-like because they're caused by this other thing or things in which essence and existence are identical. So now let's just focus on this class. Essence and existence are identical. Are there more than one such, or could there be more than one such thing? They're going to say no. Because in order for there to be more than one such thing, they would in some sense have to share the same essence, right? Because they're part of this exact same kind or category or class. So they're going to have to be of the same essence, but nevertheless have different acts of existence because they're two different things, as it were. But in that case, there's the distinction between the essence and each of their acts of existence, right? Because there's one essence there that's shared between them, but two different acts of existence. So the essence is distinct from their existence. But we suppose that this is the class in which essence and existence are identical, right? In which case there can't be more than one. That's one kind of argument that they give. Now, of course, you could challenge that. You could say no, they don't actually need to have the exact same essence. You could say this is incompatible with Trinitarianism, right? Because you have three divine persons. That doesn't require them to have different a distinction between their essence and their active existence. So it seems as though you can actually have differentiation without distinction between essence and existence, and so on. So anyway, there are different ways you can respond. But
well, I've always been curious about this because they say every object has both an existence and an essence, right? So can an object have just one without the other? So in your true dichotomy, if there is an object that had essence but no existence, then could you say that they're separate things because that it doesn't have one?
Yeah. So what they're going to want to say is that it doesn't make sense to say that there is an object with an essence but no existence, because you're saying there is such a thing. It exists, right? It exists, in which case it has existence, right? So there cannot be an object which has an essence but no existence, because to be, right, it has to have the existence. So they're going to want to rule that out. Now, what about having an existence but no essence? Now that's very interesting. I mean, again, they're going to want to say that doesn't make sense. But what's their argument for that? Well, maybe they like anything that there is. Surely, it's like a member of some sort of category. I don't know. It's like it's something. There is something that it is to be that thing. I guess that's question begging, isn't it? Because we're the hypothesis that we're assuming is that no, it actually doesn't have an essence. So I don't know their reason for ruling that out. They might just say like it just doesn't make any sense to them. That's what they might say. But that's a very interesting proposal. I mean, like,
Well, it reminds me of the Russell's paradox: the set of all sets that are not members of themselves is the set of itself.
Yeah, I love that one. I actually had a discussion with Josh Rasmussen where he argues against a traditional conception of omniscience based on that paradox. So it's very interesting. But anyway, I do have to leave sometime soon, so maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. If we could go to the fifth argument
Sure.
from Phaser. Yeah, so this argument is what he calls the rationalist proof. And it basically uses a version of the PSR, and it says, hey, contingent things require an explanation outside themselves, and moreover, they require a sustaining cause explanation. He argues that. So you can see how these aren't actually independent arguments. They're all like 4 out of 5 of them are uniformly addressed by existential inertia and other responses. But anyway, somehow he thinks that they're really like 5. But anyway, he has a second portion of his book where he ruminates on whether or not there are less or fewer. But anyway, we could set that aside. I don't want to attribute things to him that he doesn't say. So yeah, what is the argument? Well, basically contingent things, that is things that can fail to exist, that it's possible that they be absent from reality. These sorts of things require an outside explanation, and moreover, they require an explanation at any moment at which they exist. But these chains of outside explanations, one thing explaining another in terms, explaining another, in turn explaining another, and so on, that cannot be infinite. So there is a kind of unexplained explainer. And because any contingent thing requires some further explanation, this unexplained explainer is going to be necessary. And of course, in his second stage, he says, this necessary thing is God. We've already seen why that second stage is probably not going to work. There are perfectly respectable naturalist proposals on which there's a necessary foundation of reality. We went through the wave function one earlier. We talked about maybe there's some sort of quantum field at the foundation of reality that's necessarily existent. Maybe it's a collection of particles. Maybe you could go, maybe it's this impersonal Brahman or something, that we talked about earlier. There are so many different proposals. Okay, anyway, this is something that triggers me a little bit. So yeah, so that's one response that you can make. And then a second principal response, you could, of course, reject the PSR. He gives various arguments for the PSR. I don't take that response in the book. My principal response to the first stage is the existential inertia one. So I say, no, to explain a contingent object, to explain why a contingent object exists right here and right now, assuming that it's not the first moment at which it exists, all you need to do is say, like, hey, it existed earlier, and nothing in the interim came to destroy it, right? Return to the example of my water bottle. So yeah, that's my response to this fifth argument.
So why don't you reject the PSR and make that an argument in your book? Why don't you focus on that one? Isn't that like the most common one in philosophy, just to reject the PSR?
Yeah, part of it is because the literature there is huge, and that would kind of require a book in its own right, honestly. There are so many different arguments for and against that getting into that without spending multiple chapters on it, which would be out of place in my book, would be really difficult. That's one reason. A second reason is because while there are some versions of the PSR, like super strong ones that say everything requires an explanation, I reject those. I do think more restricted versions of the PSR are probably true. So I find it plausible that in general, contingent facts have explanations. And so I lean towards actually thinking that there's some sort of necessary foundation of reality. But again, that could be a perfectly respectable, naturalist friendly one. So those are two reasons why I don't.
Question on that: is there a sufficient difference between a necessary fact and a brute fact, or is a brute necessity essentially the same thing as any other brute fact?
Good question. So as I use it, so people use these terms differently, which makes it difficult. Brute is a bit of a weasel word, and that's not any one particular person's fault. It's just used differently. So here's how I use the terms. Something is brute if it doesn't have an explanation. So yeah, it's brute if it doesn't have an explanation. By contrast, something is necessary if it cannot fail to exist. It must exist. It's necessarily the case that it exists. So you can imagine something in these two. So given those definitions, these two can come apart. So there, for instance, there could be a necessary thing that does have an explanation for why it exists. Maybe the number 2 and the number 3 and all the numbers except for 1, say, have an explanation in terms of I don't know, the axioms of piano arithmetic together with the existence of 0 or something like that. You know, like every number has a successor, 0 is a number or whatever. So in some sense, you might actually have an explanation for those necessary, like the number 2, which is necessary, the number 3, which is necessary, and so on. They could have an explanation. So I don't think that necessary is like equivalent to brute. But in principle, there might be something that's necessary and brute. Maybe those axioms are brute, right? Yeah, and then contingency, you could have a further explained contingency, and some people argue that you could actually have a brute contingency in the sense of something that's contingent genuinely could have failed to exist, but it doesn't have an explanation. So yeah, that some people argue that you can have that as well. But yeah, I hope that clarifies some things.
Yeah. Do you think there is such a thing as a necessary being that exists in all possible worlds, or is there such a thing where you can have all worlds that are mutually exclusive and share no properties?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I actually I have a favored theory of modality. It's actually one that Graham Oppie likes, and it's a view on which different possible worlds are actually only possible in virtue of branching away from the actual world. And so different possibilities are kind of grounded in the causal powers of actual things. And it's a kind of a complicated derivation, but from that you can swiftly get something necessary in our world, essentially, basically. Something that necessarily exists and that's shared across all worlds, because all worlds, right, all other worlds are possible only insofar as they branch away from the actual world. So eventually you trace back to the actual world. So every world does, in fact, overlap with the actual world, shares some sort of, let's say, causally initial segment with it, or something like that. In which case, that causally initial segment would be in common to all those different worlds. So that's the basic idea. There are technicalities and complications to that. But I do find it plausible because I think there are antecedent motivations for this view of the modality. And yeah, and the very fact that Graham Oppie accepts it is itself a motivation for it. It's funny.
Argument from Graham Oppie.
Yeah, exactly.
So you said, want to be respectful of your time. You said you had to go. So it was great having you on. Really enjoyed talking with you, and good luck with your book and your graduation. I hope you don't flunk out. That would suck. Especially
yes, exactly. Yeah, that's actually the reason why I have to go. So finals week is literally not this week, but the next week. So it's dead week this week. So I have to, I'm literally studying right after I log off of here. So
awesome. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. And I will talk to you later.
All right, sweet.